Multiculturalism is an inescapable fact of reality. We may think of it as something that we can escape, but we cannot. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings have had to deal with people who don't look, sound, and act like them. If you try and escape this fact, you will be stuck in one single corner of Earth. But some people believe that this is a good idea. Some people believe that some people should be forbidden from leaving certain parts of Earth and they themselves should live in prison. If we take England, for example, their entire culture is a mixture of several different cultures. Christianity came from the Middle East. A lot of their technology came from the Middle East. Science came from the Middle East. Not to mention the Greeks, the Romans, and so much more. People who do not live amongst them or did not live amongst them for tens of thousands of years and then added to the civilization by moving there. But today, they seem to have forgotten this.
We are told repeatedly that we are a multicultural society and that this is supposed to be able to work, but it's in fact a dangerous illusion that will cause the inevitable balkanization of our countries into separate warring tribes.
The problem with this opinion is that it makes it feel like it's culture that is responsible for warring tribes. It's something called civil war, where two people who come from the same culture disagree. As soon as you allow opinion, you risk the ability for there to be separate peoples who balkanize inside their own nation. I mean, let's take the left and the right. Do they not have such opinions that they almost seem like they don't come from the same place? Especially if you take the extreme right, which believes in racism and things like that, and then you take the extreme left, which believes in dismantling basic human biology. If you take these two people and you put them in the same place, you would never guess if you didn't know that they come from the exact same nations. But take a center right person in anywhere really, and you compare them to another center right person anywhere in the world, and they will come across as if they belong to the same group. Take a Christian from Yemen and compare him to a Christian in England. They will have the same beliefs for the most part.
The problem is the lie at the heart of the concept of multiculturalism.
Notice first and foremost that he does not use culture as an example. This image that I'm showing you depicts culture, not race. The image he shows is fully westernized people standing side by side who are of different races. In other words, he is not talking about culture, he's talking about race. And this is the problem at the core of anti culturalism, multiculturalism, is that they believe that certain races can never be part of a certain culture, but this is not how it works. And we know it doesn't work because we know an entire continent that destroyed their own culture and replaced it with several others. We know multiple continents like that.
Which prevents any such thing from actually coming into being. And that is the idea that different and conflicting cultures can live harmoniously side by side and maintain their own cultural distinctiveness, traditions, and most importantly, sense of justice in the face of an ethnically neutral Leviathan which rules over them all.
To be honest, that kind of sounds like the British Empire. Why did they think that was a good idea when they did it? Wasn't that multiculturalism? I mean, I know eventually they wanted it to all be British, but that's what it was, wasn't it?
The liberal international order labours under the delusion that its rules are neutral, universal, and compatible with every culture. However, this is clearly not the case. Liberalism itself is, as Michael Oakeshott observed, merely the abridgment of the English political tradition, abstracted into a doctrine, which then becomes a self-justifying ideology that can be applied in any place and at any time. Any ideology is a set of ontological statements from which propositional political demands can be derived, and these are rooted in the values of the people from which the ideology originates. When an ideology is repeated back to the people from which it originated, it acts as a kind of reflecting mirror, showing them the best of what they already believe to be true.
Oh, that sounds awful. So it takes a culture which has problems, and then, in its own opinion, it cuts away the fat. It gets rid of the bad ideas, and then it shines back the good ideas. Well, that sounds terrible. That sounds terrible. Why would you do that? Why would you have someone come to a different culture instead of just replacing it or leaving them to their, you know, to their folly? Why would they come in and shine a light on the good stuff and, destroy the bad stuff? That sounds awful.
They already possess the necessary beliefs and institutions to fulfill the demands of the ideology. However, when it is applied to foreign people, it shows them idealized versions of things which are not true about themselves.
Well, how could that possibly be true? Every single culture in the world has a concept of freedom, and it has concepts that are good. So it is impossible for that to be true. Unless, of course, you believe that the only people who can come up with good ideas are people who live in England.
And demands that they ought to be. This is often devastating and causes utter chaos and great bloodshed as the established classes and institutions of the foreign society are rendered immoral and then liquidated by revolutionaries, chasing the vision of what the reflecting mirror showed them.
Okay, so still being very vague about what countries exactly he's talking about, especially since he's showing Western countries over there. But, let's pretend for a second that what he's talking about is true, that he wants every culture to remain in its own place. So why are there so many rules telling other countries what to do, coming from the West specifically, telling other countries what to do, imposing human rights, if those countries don't want that, then they don't want that. Will that be accepted? And also, how long will it take until, several countries develop atom bombs and then you come back and say, let's impose this, that, and that, and that. I don't know if some people can say it's got nothing to do with multiculturalism. Well, this anti-multiculturalism concept is about being left alone. And so why can't those countries be left alone too, to their folly?
As with all ideology, liberalism's ethnically particular origins are masked by its abstract nature, and its claims to universality and neutrality are, in fact, particular and value laden, with a series of presuppositions that we, the English speaking world, fail to interrogate because we live within the political tradition that is being reflected back at us.
Well, or maybe some people have a good eye for the cultures and the internal. I mean, let's be honest. He said English world, which I don't know what it means. Does it mean England or does it mean countries that speak English? Because obviously, there's so much bigger countries that speak English than just what he thinks. But if he means the English world and he's trying to include other countries like America and stuff, American culture is very different than British culture. I mean, if we take freedom of speech alone, you're already looking at a completely different culture in terms of how they think things should be run.
The ideology tells us that we are indeed the fairest in the land, and what we take for granted we then assume to be characteristic of the entire human race.
Of course, and that is why most people who live in certain parts of the West, not most, but some people who live in some parts of the West, want to maintain it and keep it exactly as it is, even though the reason why the West has been dominating for a long time is because they didn't keep their culture exactly the same. They changed as the winds of fortune changed. To call yourselves the fairest in the world is to be ignorant. A lot of the concepts that were created, I mean, here's something people don't want to talk about. Where was communism invented? Where was socialism invented? Capitalism, all of these things that people say, oh, they're ideologies that were spread across the world, and we see examples that they don't fail. Where were all these ideologies invented?
And this is simply not true. The liberal multiculturalist assumes that there is a set of values, coincidentally their own values, by which the entire human race could consent to live.
Because they don't have a choice. It's either they give them the best ideas and ask people to relate to them and say, hey, you could live with these values, can't you? Or let people live the way they want to live. And if that means, this is why I don't believe in some ideas of maintaining tribes, even if they're dangerous for each other. Tribes where, hey, on your 13th birthday, we're gonna cut your arm off or something. That's not that's not okay. You don't just let people suffer and die just because you think that you can't change people's minds. You can absolutely change people's minds. And the reason why is because biology. I mean, if you believe in biology, then human beings are born without information. They gain information through learning. And if you gain information through learning, then you can learn anything.
And therefore sees no contradiction in bringing all of the peoples of the world to live under the liberal Leviathan, and assumes that they will do so in peace. However, as we have seen, this doesn't seem to be the case, and even some of the most
Freedom is reality. Life is reality. Free from struggle is a kind of reality. But peace is a myth. There is no culture, no custom, no world that you can get peace. How about love? That's a concept that's more real because all of this requires humans to participate. Peace means you will get every single human, I don't care where you go, you will get every single human to agree never to do wrong. And this will never happen. And it has never happened. And I don't care how good the ideas are, it will never happen. And in fact, I I'll give you a quote. I remember some person said this, I'd rather be offended than bored. And this lies at the heart of why human beings will never have peace, because they would rather have something happen than to live in a country where it's peaceful, but nothing ever happens. So, in other words, everybody has the same things, same amount of money, same all of that. They would never accept that if it means that they will live a boring life. And that is peace. Peace is boring and no one wants it.
arch liberal proponents of multiculturalism have admitted that the project has failed. We can look at the concept of multiculturalism as a form of extreme cultural vanity in which a people have become so possessed of their own moral righteousness that they delude themselves into thinking that their way of life is the only way of life, and even just the mere exposure of it to foreign peoples will persuade them to become like us.
This isn't just applying to the West, but this is true for the majority of the populations anywhere. People who move to just about any place in any time in history seem to fuse with the culture that they come to, whatever dominant culture that is. Whether we're talking about the Islamic world, whether we're talking about the Americas, whether we're talking about Africa, anywhere where you go, where there is a dominant population, people fuse with it for the most part. Even the West, pick whatever place you want to pick. And this idea that there is no multiculturalism probably comes from extreme people who refuse to mix with the population, but that's got nothing to do with multiculturalism, especially not the way you laid it down, where they pick apart certain areas which are bad.
instead of persisting in the false consciousness of their old ways. Again, we can now see the folly of such self aggrandizement. I think the issue stems fundamentally from the concept of justice. There are, of course, many competing conceptions of justice, which I'm not going to explore here.
Even though there are competing versions of justice and law and order and peace, I want to lay out a certain thing that would give people a easy path. See, opinions are subjective, but if you give out a rule or a direction, then you can start to get objective about how you get to that area. For example, if you are religious or something and you believe that life is sacred, then after that your axioms or the things that have to follow after that will have to be global in concept, unless you don't believe that every human's life is sacred. If you believe that only your neighbors or only you and your people are sacred, then that will happen. But outside of that, then you can do whatever you want.
But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to use Aristotle's definition, which can be broadly summarized as people getting what they are due.
It's funny that he uses Aristotle as an example. I mean, you can see that he's got the face of the Akkadian over there, which is also hilarious, which means, he's using a lot of imagery from foreign nations. But it's funny that he's going to use Aristotle. Um, doesn't that fall flat on the idea that you're talking about non-multiculturalism if you're going to use someone who was Aristotle English? Did he come from the English world? I know at that time the English didn't exist, but isn't that the point? In order for you or for the English world to exist, it had to start from multiple cultures coming together to create what it is. And then some of the geniuses of that English culture, like Shakespeare, were inspired by what? Other cultures.
Justice, to Aristotle, is when a person's deserts morally align with the character of their actions. And this is, in my opinion, the best definition of justice.
That is a horrible definition of justice because, of course, acting moral doesn't mean you deserve anything, to be honest, outside of small things. I mean, take reality, for example. So it's idealistic, right? If you act morally, you should be rewarded and become bigger. But this doesn't work. And I'll tell you why. If you look at the entire world, I mean, take the music industry, take any industry, acting immorally has pushed people all the way to the top. Now, you could say, okay, what he's saying is you should, they shouldn't be rewarded for acting immorally. But that would crush the entire Western world if that was a fact. If you got what you deserved based on your morals, the entire Western world would fall apart. Abrahamic faiths have already discovered justice a long time ago. They've already discovered the best way to operate with humans, which is every life is sacred. And whatever you have to do to protect those lives, that's what you have to do. That's the direction that you have to go. Even those who are unjust, because or even those who are immoral, because anyone can change at any time. What's that quote? When I say to a wicked man, change your ways, and that wicked man does not change his ways, that wicked man will die for his sins, and I will hold you accountable for them. Another way of putting this is think about how many immoral things you've done and never paid anything for. And you probably shouldn't because you wouldn't have been a good person otherwise, especially if they were exposed. Not all good deeds should be rewarded, and not all bad deeds should be punished. It's a scary thought, but it's realistic.
and how we can measure a just society. Moreover, I think it's the definition most people assume when they consider what justice actually is or is not.
I'll be honest with you. I don't want to devastate you, but most people don't believe in justice. Most people do not believe we live in a just world. Most people don't believe that we can live in a just world. Most people believe we live in an unequal world. And speaking about it, unequal, wasn't it Aristotle who said, treat the equal equally and the unequal unequally? Even he didn't believe in an equal world. Nobody believes in that. Justice is a frame. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as justice. You cannot have justice in the world. It's impossible. This doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to act morally. I think we should. And I definitely think that we should treat people right and everything. But the best way to start with that is to start with every human being is valuable, no matter what country they come from. And we should try to increase their quality of life. And if you start there, you will get somewhere beautiful. But other than that, there is no such thing as justice. You're not going to get justice by pretending like every moral action that happens should be rewarded and you should. No, it's not going to happen. It will never happen.
But we can already see how this presupposes a shared moral framework to come to the conclusion that people are receiving the consequences that they ought.
Okay, so if you believe that, you believe if you do bad things, you should get consequences for it. Okay, so let's start at the bottom. What consequences should the European countries that tore Africa into smithereens, what should they get? What consequences did they suffer for what they did? What consequences should the American populations or the American system suffer for destroying Native American populations? What consequences are people suffering today for the tons, the Iraqi war? All of this, everything. What consequences are they suffering? Now, if you don't believe what I was saying about justice, most people think they shouldn't suffer. Most people think that they should just correct the behavior and reduce the amount of violence going on in the world, which is the concept I was giving. To say that they should be rewarded and punished accurately, that will never happen because it doesn't give any incentive for the people to change, really. Because I'll get into it another time. It's too deep. You know what's that old saying? I don't know how they say it, but it's like if you're gonna get your arms chopped off for stealing something small, you might as well just steal something big. Justice cannot be put down into one quote. That's why it has to remain vague and say just it has to have human human life at the core of it.
And therefore, we conclude that our society itself is just.
If you believe that your society is just, then you are just confused. That is not a reality. Even logic, even all these things will tell you. I'll give you an example, right? So, what gender is responsible for most of the violent crime in the world, right? But you're not going to reduce certain rights for a specific gender in order to make sure that thing like for example women are less violent than men. Putting women in charge of things where things are violent would be the just thing to do in a world where you get rewarded for your your behavior, but that no one's going to do that because that feels unjust, even though it would be just under these circumstances, under these conditions.
If a group of people hold different moral foundations, which leads them inevitably to moral conclusions which differ from our own, then they can come to feel that the society in which they live is not just unpleasant, but instead morally abominable to an extreme degree.
Now, I'm glad that he showed Muslims, because what he doesn't understand is that Islamic countries, for the most part, have very similar views to the views that he has, and that a lot of the sort of clashes are religious in nature. But if you really look at the core, they agree between the religious people of Islam and the Western Christianity. The only difference is that when it comes to sort of quote unquote extremism or whatever, that is the extreme version of Christianity and the extreme version of Islam. And I remember someone saying Islam and Christianity are like a battery. They're like a battery. And a lot of people like to treat them like they're two completely separate entities, but they are the same. They are the same thing and they have the same concepts. When Christianity is extreme, you cannot tell it apart from Islam. Now, when it happens more these days, people go, "Oh, that's a consequence of Islam." It is not. When Christianity is extreme, even doesn't matter how many times it occurs. When it's extreme, it's got the backing, the cultural backing to be extreme, just like Islam does. And when it's mild, like several Islamic countries, or even people who live outside of Islamic countries but are have Islam, it's got the cultural backing to be mild. To say that these cultures cannot coexist is to take the extremes, the middle extremes, and whatever, and say that these are the culture, but then ignore the extremes of the other. In other words, you need a resistor. If you have a resistor within your culture, none of these religions are going to be as terrible as they can be. And a lot of the times, no one wants to live in a terrible country.
And I think this is the fundamental root of terrorism and explains why, for example, Islamic extremists who hold to a strict Quranic reading.
Islamic terrorists do not hold to an extreme Quranic reading. They have a little bit of a foundation within Islam, and then they use political and all of that in order to justify their actions, and also the fact that they're, you know, dudes. So they have certain needs which, because they don't care about human life, they will take out on everybody else. They will get to what they want without consideration of other people's emotions or lives. But this foundation can be found in just about any other religion. If you would like, go read history. Go read history. Go find out if there is no such thing as extreme Christianity. Go find out if there is no such thing as extreme any religion in the past. I will show you that they exist. Now, because there are plenty in number today in other parts, you will make the excuse that it's part of it, but that is not a fact.
Suddenly decide that they have to strike out at Western society and with such brutality. Not only is the society they're surrounded by un Islamic, but it is monstrous according to the moral code in which they believe, and they are duty bound to try and destroy it.
Okay, I think I've already answered the question of whether or not that extreme behavior comes from whether or not they're Muslim. I think that has nothing to do with it. But to prove this, are there not um, left leaning people in America who want to crush the Western world? People who are non Islamic. Are there not people who are in the extreme left? And this is going to tell you extremes, this is how they work. And are there not people in the extreme right who believe in crushing this Western world and going back to another Western world, or even going to a world which will be completely, I mean, you've sort of put yourself in that place by saying you don't believe in multiculturalism. But are there not people who don't believe in Islam? The one thing that is similar, that is common, that you will find with extremists is that they have very strong political ideas. You can be an atheist, you can be whatever you want. One thing you will notice is that the one thread, the one line that goes through all of these people is that they have extreme political ideas. And if you don't believe me, go find some terrorists and go interview them and ask them, do you give a damn about politics? And see if they don't literally start, clenching their teeth with anger when they talk about politics.
And so we come to the crux of the lie of multiculturalism, in that an assumed set of liberal universal values can be applied to all people, revolving around the fulcrum of human rights.
See, there you go. So even you are an extremist. You do not believe that human rights are universal. So you're extremely against the West. You think that certain people should not, we shouldn't live under the assumption that all people should be, I don't know what the word is, but they should be forced or whatever to apply human rights. This is an extreme take.
This is a Western prejudice.
Nope, it's not a Western prejudice, and it has applied many times over. I mean, the word right obviously is an English word, but if you go look at the laws in the Islamic Golden Age, if you go look at laws in the Swahili Coast, you go look at laws in the egalitarian worlds of West Africa, if you go look at the Quechan life, if you go look at the Native Americans, the democracies that existed prior to the Europeans landing there, you will find these concepts all over. The very concept of human rights. Take the Iroquois, for example. The Iroquois was a nation that used to, I mean, let's be honest, they used to get people into their nation two ways. One, they would get people via force, so slavery, and another one is they would trade and get people into their society that way, you know, people having intercourse with one another. This meant that anybody of any race, of any culture, could change their culture because they lived in a democracy, an Iroquois democracy. And a black man who started as a slave and then was purchased by an Iroquois man, ended up being the leader of the Mohawk. His culture was completely different than that of the Mohicans, but that didn't stop anything. He is only one of the Native Americans under the Iroquois nation who are of different race than the original people, and they started with very different concepts. These people used to argue all the time, which that's what democracy is for. They used to argue all the time, and in fact, it caused a separation. The reason why it died was because there was another culture that didn't want that culture to survive. I mean, still stole their ideas, didn't want it to survive. That was the American culture that did everything in its power to crush a semi or more peaceful than their civilization, and then of course steal their concepts. In Thomas Jefferson's book, which is not the same Thomas Jefferson as the other dude, but in Thomas Jefferson, a local statesman, he states in his book, From Notes of Virginia, he states the concept of justice is alive within the Native Americans. because even though they belong to five separate tribes, if a man from any of those tribes is hurt, it is as if they themselves were hurt, and the law acts in accordance.
We have seen that many other groups simply do not believe in the liberal ontology regarding the individual, and in fact derive a separate and contradictory set of assumptions from entirely alien traditions, which leads them to very different moral conclusions.
You mean alien traditions like Christianity is alien to the West? Secondly, this idea, the concept that the individual doesn't matter, that the whole idea of the individual being important came from Christianity. Christianity comes from the Middle East, and it's also being imported into Islam. This is a fact. It has been a fact for a long time. What culture is it that you're talking about that does not value the individual? There are cultures like that, but the biggest one I can think of right now is the ones that believe that individuals from other countries should be kicked out and screw their worldview, screw where they come from, screw what they're going through. They are not individuals. They are belonging to a group of radical people who come from radical countries. Does that is that a concept of individuality?
So, what can the multicultural state do? What must they do?
Well, based on what you said, they have to close themselves in and be ignorant to outsider thoughts and pretend like they have all the best ideas, and throughout time they will remain exactly the same. Now, I can think of only one country that did that successfully for a long time. I think that's Japan. And because of that, they fell behind severely. Now, the good parts is they didn't get taken over early by the Western world like a lot of countries were. It's good for defense, but it's bad for attack because once the world had gotten further enough, they just came there. Matthew Perry just came there. It was like, open your borders, and there's nothing they could do about it because technology had moved so far.
If the Leviathan is to be non particular about the people from which it has emerged and is composed of, then it must begin with its conceit of universality and attempt not to play favourites, but in doing so it is compelled to reinforce the original doctrine that itself is the source of the problem, and this itself undermines the premise upon which multiculturalism rests. The liberal multiculturalist has no choice but to assert their universal doctrine of human rights in the face of these competing moral frameworks.
Yeah, but you're not a foreigner, and you're suffering already from wanting to crush human rights, which is a fundamental part of Western values. So it's clearly not something that has to do with Western or outsiders. It's extremists. And in this situation, you've put yourself into the extreme category where you think, well, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but it seems like you think that human rights should not apply universally, which is weird.
And impose them upon the apparently equal groups in the multicultural society, and they have to use the power of the Leviathan to do it. And they have to do it against the doctrines of the group from which the values conflict has arisen. However, in doing so, they confess that their project can never really be multicultural at all.
Nope. Actually, they have proven over and over again. And like I said, this is why I said this in the beginning. Multiculturalism is inescapable. Go look in history, go look everywhere. Multiculturalism is inescapable. There is no place, there is no corner you can find on earth where people refused to fuse with other cultures forever. It will never happen.
It is not possible to allow conflicting moral systems to persist without issue in the same polity, which is why they have to impose their ideology on the foreign groups, making them not equals, but subject peoples to an ideology which itself springs from the dominant ethnic group.
Or it's actually competing ideas in which foreign ideas get thrown into the bucket, and then the best ideas float to the top and are utilized, versus just taking anybody's concept and saying that we should apply them equally. Multiculturalism does not mean we apply all ideas equally. I mean, even if you take away multiculturalism, just culture in general is not applying all ideas equally. Ideas still have to be fought against and fought for, even in the darkest times in, medieval Europe or wherever, where people didn't want to change from their concepts. People still fought against certain concepts, certain ideas. This is why you find religions or the dominant version of Christianity changing over and over again, even in the West, because people were fighting over ideas, literally attacking each other, physically removing kings forcefully for their ideas.
One culture must dominate over the others and impose its will in a classic imperial fashion, or the entire project ends in ruin, which itself destroys the fundamental conceit of multiculturalism.
Well, let's take the Islamic Golden World again, for example. In Turkey, in Africa, in so many places, women's rights or women's freedoms were accepted in a way that they weren't in other parts like Yemen and places like that. This had nothing to do with incompatibility. When Ibn Battuta went to Africa, he didn't like what he saw, but he understood, okay, these guys are Islamic, so we gotta operate with them. And the reason why this is true is because not only can competing methods or competing ideas go with each other, there is no choice. There is no choice. At some point, someone's got to put their foot down and go, this idea is better than that one. And if you don't, I mean, these arbitrary false borders that you have, if you don't think that is just pure ideology, then you wait. Put your borders up and don't tell other people what to do outside of your borders, and then wait and see if they'll never do anything to you. I mean, already you're complaining that they already are doing stuff to you, but you have to impose some level of morality even on people who don't belong to your culture. Otherwise, they will do something to you.
The only possible multicultural state is an empire.
Okay, but wouldn't an empire also be at risk if the people in the country believed in completely different concepts? Isn't that why empires got crushed? That they didn't believe in the core beliefs of the empire, like how America didn't want to be part of the empire. To say that it's like boogeyman tactics to be like, oh, the only way the one thing that multiculturalism works within is an empire. No, it doesn't. The reason why India threw off uh, England, and the reason why a lot of African countries threw off the European countries, is because they knew that they do not belong to the same culture, and that culture is a threat to their own. So to say the only way that a state it's an empire, prove that multiculturalism thrives better in non-empires. Empires fall, and they fall fast.
It is also not unreasonable to think that the minority communities, which are the prize jewels of our multicultural project, and used by its advocates against the majority ethnic community, will feel that they are not only in danger from the majority community, but are also wards of a state that is currently constraining it.
Counterpoint, a lot of times when people feel like that, it's probably because there really is an attack on those people. Let's not pretend that they're just making it up. Let's not pretend there are no people who come after even the good ideas. of their culture. Let's not pretend that it's just extremists versus, a civilized state. I mean, let's take deportation, just deportation. Do they not want to deport, like, even like little girls who have no concepts of any of this stuff, or just random people? We know what's going on. We know that it has nothing to do with this extremist or whatever, because of course, how many people are extremists? Your country would be finished if the majority of people who wanted to come into the country wanted to destroy the culture of England. It would already have been done.
They are told that they may live lives authentic to the traditions from which they came, whilst at the same time being hemmed in by the very same power that is encouraging them to be traditional.
Yeah, this is like a bastardization of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism does not mean you will live purely like your culture says, and then you won't have another culture being constantly in your presence. In fact, multiculturalism means there will always be cultures around you that you do not belong to.
This contradiction naturally leads to ethnic separatism, in which they correctly realise that self governance would be preferable because at least it would be on their own terms.
Why would voting for pro-Palestine be anti-Britain or anti-England? That doesn't make sense to me. Unless you see Israel, another culture, as part of your own. In which case, I don't understand why you're against multiculturalism, because it's not separate. It's not separate for someone to support a foreign state that is different than the foreign state you support.
Only by having people from their own community and bursting the bonds of the liberal Leviathan can, from their perspective, the promise of multiculturalism be fulfilled, which destroys the unitary multicultural state and creates ethnic insurrections against the host country. Anything else is, from their perspective, a state of injustice.
Or not. I mean, let's not pretend that people don't try to join the civilization that's there. Let's not pretend. Again, if something is unjust, people will disagree with it. But, you know, do whatever you want with this information. If you believe that, the best way to live is to have one culture that cannot be questioned, then you go right on ahead and see how long that will last.
Which may be temporarily tolerated at best, and openly revolted against at worst, and dealing with ethnic revolts against the hegemonic power of the overgroup is historically just part and parcel of running an empire.
And again, some concepts, just because they belong to the majority group, doesn't mean they're correct and they should be fought against. And of course, if you belong to the majority group, you probably don't see it as the worst thing that ever happened until it starts affecting you negatively. Then all of a sudden, it's the worst thing that's ever happened. What's that song? You got your rules and your religions all designed to keep you safe, but when rules start getting broken, you start questioning your faith.
The liberal state, which intends to practice multiculturalism, is forced to admit that its own origin and theory is, in fact, parochial and committed to an ethnic ideological framework.
Well, of course it is, and that framework is multiculturalism. If you go against that, then you will be pushed back, just like democracy. Democracy does not allow you to do whatever you want. I mean, I've heard people say, what if what if in a democracy people vote that the democracy should disappear? But it can't. This means that it's not completely free. You can't, there are rules to multiculturalism. That does not mean it's a contradiction. It just means you misunderstand what the word multiculturalism. You expand it to mean multiculturalism means that Islamic people are going to live in this bucket, and then people who are Christian are going to live in this bucket. That's not multiculturalism. Multiculturalism means there will be a blend, a melting pot, which has worked for a long time in many places around the world for a pretty long time. In empires, not so much. But nothing really works in empires. The fact that people live in an empire means that it's doomed to failure.
which is just the reflected vanity of the moral righteousness of the people from whom it originated. There is no such thing as human rights.
The fact that he doesn't believe in human rights is hilarious because, of course, that is almost a core part of quote unquote modern Western values. But let's first read this so that we can understand exactly what I mean. Western normative assumptions frequently dominate the human rights discourse, creating an unnecessarily divisive environment. Two factors account for this. First, Westerners have come to believe that their understanding of human rights a product of their own histories. Notably, the Enlightenment and the rights revolution and notions about natural rights represents the obligations laid down in human rights treaties. Second, Westerners play an extraordinary large role as funders and conveners of human rights organizations and scholarly debates, directly and indirectly shaping agendas, frameworks of analysis, and evaluation methods in the process. The result is that most human rights campaigners believe that all states parties to human rights treaties have committed themselves to the Western view of human rights. This approach risks liberal monism as it converts cultural norms in one part of the world into universal rights. Working with this singular worldview, human rights actors and scholars often view alternative ways of living and of achieving a good and just society as inferior or backward. Not only is there such a thing as human rights, but human rights have existed for quite a long time. Now, of course, because in the Western world, they found their way towards certain human rights in a specific way, they must believe that they are the only people in the world to ever create the concept of human rights. But if you go to Ashoka, the Buddhists, if you go to all of these people, you'll find fundamental rights for a lot of things. Now, some people are going to say there's bad things that happened back then. There's bad things happening now. There's prisoners and all kinds of stuff where bad things happen to people. There's soldiers who come back and tell horrible stories of how they were treated. Workers, literally people who are employed, who live lives of never mind. But if we continue down this path, we will see that rights occur everywhere, especially human rights, fundamental human rights. But, the West wants to believe that they invented it and everybody else does not have it. Which, by the way, it's not the entire West because, again, a lot of people who are Christian know about the fact that, the West, before the West even existed as a modern concept, Christianity believed that all souls were sacred. So,
There are only the rights of Englishmen applied to the whole human race, and much of the human race don't want them because they have ideas of their own.
I will admit that the rest of the argument was kind of nuanced a little bit, but once you get to that last statement, that was a bogus statement. England or the English? Come on. The other people have ideas of their own. So, people in England have ideas of their own. Does everyone in England who belongs to a certain ethnic group, do they all have the exact same ideas? Do they all believe in the exact same concepts? I mean, you don't even believe in human rights. How many people in England do you think will disagree with you that there's such a thing, that there's no such thing as rights? Everything you're saying does not make any sense, not even a little. Now, I would respect what he's saying if he didn't believe, if he believed in what he's saying completely. But let's take South Africa, for example. In South Africa, he supports the sort of runaway culture, the Afrikaner runaway culture that wants to isolate themselves within the country of South Africa. But what about integration there? What about them being forced to integrate within the South African culture and not separating themselves and becoming a pure concept completely on their own? What about that? It seems like he's more concerned that England should be a area of oneness, but South Africa should be balkanized between the blacks and the whites.
The South Africans who recently arrived in the United States are, in my opinion, actual legitimate refugees
I am so surprised.
from a racial state that is operating a kind of informal form of stochastic terrorism against them.
So, for those of you that don't know, stochastic terrorism is a form of political violence instigated by a hostile public rhetoric directed at a group or an individual. Unlike incitement to terrorism, stochastic terrorism is accomplished with indirect, vague, or coded language, which grants the instigator plausible deniability for any associated violence. A key element of stochastic terrorism is the use of media and propagation, where the person carrying out the violence may not have direct connection to any other users of violent rhetoric. Now, I can think of a president of the United States who this applies, but let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the previous video he made. I'll leave it at that.
And so the reaction that I'll cover elsewhere is just crazy to these people coming to the United States. Because if anyone actually was a victim of persecution, it is the white people in South Africa, the descendants of Dutch and English colonists who
Right. No one is more deserving of it, right? Not North Koreans, not people in Yemen being bombed, not Palestinians. Nobody. No one deserves it more than white people in South Africa who are suffering under stochastic terrorism. Huh?
have been there for hundreds of years now, they are genuinely being persecuted.
I love how even in his opening statement, he throws in that they are descendants of colonists. Okay, they were colonists, right? And they've been in South Africa for hundreds of years. Doing what? What were they doing in those hundreds of years in their colony? And where did it leave the colonized?
By the black majority controlled government. And so this is just wild. And I'll take you through some of these things. So here's an official statement from the African National Congress, the ANC, which is the ruling government of South Africa.
While it has won the majority for a very long time, it is losing a lot of support and it's been shedding a lot of support in recent years over and over again. The second largest party is something called the Democratic Alliance, which he will not mention, which is almost completely against this concept, which, by the way, it cannot be the second biggest without Black Native Africans supporting it. But, let's not show that. Let's not show that concept. Let's pretend that everybody in South Africa is just for the ANC.
And they are just lying through their teeth, right? They say this. Let it be clearly, categorically stated, there are no Afrikaner refugees in South Africa. Well, obviously you're a refugee from South Africa.
What they mean is there are no Afrikaner people who should qualify for refugee status in South Africa. That's why they're saying in South Africa.
No section of our society is hounded, persecuted, or subject to ethnic victimization. That's so obviously not true.
Well, I'm assuming they mean by the state, but okay. Because not by the state. I mean, you could go to Western Cape and you can find a whole bunch of white people being racist towards black people. I mean, you could go to any province in South Africa and you'll find that.
These claims are a fabrication and a cowardly political construct designed to delegitimize our democracy and insult the sacrifices made by generations who fought for freedom.
The part they left out is that South Africa is being used as a pawn for racists worldwide who want to talk about white people, but they're too cowardly to state that, and so they pretend they care about the plight of the Afrikaner, a group of people they wouldn't have known if they were not white, which is why they don't know any other tribes in Africa. There are probably people you could put a more legitimate uh, thing about their sort of hate, like their fact that they're hated in South Africa, but they're not concerned about those people. You know, I mean, anyone who lives in Africa will tell you about the bad assumptions that come from people from Nigeria and South Africa.
The thing is, if the white population of South Africa wasn't being treated as a, a, a resource to be extracted from and a whipping boy to be abused, and in the most horrific manner, I just want to be clear.
I don't think there's anyone, even if I take the most extreme version of this argument, it's clear that he doesn't know what he's talking about here. A whipping boy to be abused, a resource to be extracted. What are you talking about? That's got nothing to do with why they're claiming to be refugees. They're claiming to be refugees because they believe that they're under attack. Not that we want to use them as like whipping boys. What the hell? They're using. Never mind. Let me not state the truth too much on here about who actually works on their farms for almost nothing.
Then this might not seem so hollow, but instead, they make this a political issue. The misuse of refugee protections to shield right wing anti transformation elements is a violation of the spirit and letter of international law. Millions around the world face real persecution, and they're the ones deserving of sanctuary, not those offended by a democratic society working to redress past injustice.
Before he goes on to state what he's going to state, I want you to remember what he said before about balkanization and how there's no fundamental rights and all that other stuff. Keep that in mind as you watch this video.
Well, I'm sorry, I find it just impossible to believe that there isn't persecution against the white population in South Africa.
What's it called again? When someone thinks something is impossible to be different than what he believes. There's a word for it. Is that like dogma? Is that what he's illustrating right now?
So you've got this as a perfect example. January this year, Cyril Ramaphosa, however you pronounce it,
Cyril Ramaphosa. There, I helped you.
uh, signed into law a bill that would allow land seizures by the state without compensation. So he would be able to steal land from the white farmers and give it to his black patrons without compensating them in return.
It's a lot more complicated than that, but again, it has to do with apartheid and how land was already stolen. So how can you steal what is stolen? You know, it's like never mind. It's like someone taking your house, and then when you take it back, the guy says you stole my house that I stole from you. It's like, well,
This is just expropriation, as communists would have it. And it's not like the ANC isn't a socialist party, but then to.
again, here is the part that he's not throwing in here, which is the fact that this is still debated between political parties in South Africa, and a lot of black people in South Africa don't even agree with this land act thing. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just throwing it out there as real information. A lot of black South Africans do not agree with the land act of 2025. And again, if you want to read it, if you want to look it up, it's all over the internet. It's all over the news. I'll put a link in there to some people explaining it, but it's going to be very different than what he explains. And also, he's acting like all the people in Africa support this, and then nobody is going against it or anything like that.
I suppose to their left, there are much more hardline communists who are also eating up a large percentage of their voter base.
Like every country in the world, there is some socialist ideas inside of South Africa, just like America, but they're not communist or socialist. For the most part, South Africa is a capitalist nation, and the majority of their parties are capitalist with some socialist ideas. There are some pure communist parties, but they have no real support.
Frustration over the slow pace of land reform in South Africa has been mounting, and the new Expropriation Act aims to accelerate the redistribution of land in the country.
An expropriation act that we've had in South Africa, that we've been using before the enactment of this new one, was the 1975 Act, and this is really of January 2025.
The act has already sparked a backlash from the DA and the Freedom Front. Plus, both parties, which are part of the South African coalition government, argued that while land reform is necessary, the process of passing this law was flawed.
So there lies the problem, in which he has no idea about the economic circumstances of South Africa and how much it needs to change and how much some of these reforms, land reforms, need to be put in place. So much so that even opponents of this current one believe that it still needs to happen, just in a better way. He has no concept of this in his head. It's just, I don't know, a terrorism.
For example, Julius Malema's EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters. You know the ones.
Alliance, shoot to kill, Hamasa, kill the poor, the farmer, kill the poor, the farmer.
Now, this is absolutely not acceptable in any kind of democratic civilization, right?
No, actually, it is perfectly okay in a democratic society because it's been debated over, it's been talked about, it's been taken to court, and it's perfectly okay to sing anti-colonial songs. So yeah, there you go.
You understand when you've got an entire stadium, like 50,000 people, chanting, kill the farmer, meaning kill the white man in South Africa, and they're doing a little song and dance about it. The media has defended this, saying, well, this is just symbolic. It's not literal. And it's like, okay, well, if there weren't so many farm murders, maybe I'd agree with you.
Can I first state that these songs were created prior to 1993? So a lot of these songs have nothing to do with modern people. It has to do with people living in apartheid who are part of the the Boer identity, who are trying to oppress Africans. And what are you going to sing? Let's say you're being oppressed by someone. What are you going to sing against those people? And then these songs carry on until today because, of course, we're not just going to drop them. It's a celebration of freedom. But then now they want to apply it as if they're saying that they should go and get people today. Now, are there a lot of people who are dead on farms? Yes. The majority of them are black, if you don't know.
But even then, probably not an acceptable way to form a coherent and cohesive society, is it?
Bell number one. Now he wants a cohesive society. Before, he didn't want one. Now he wants one.
It's in fact insane and seems to be something akin to genocidal rhetoric. I mean, how would you describe this as something other than genocidal rhetoric?
Well, if you really want to know, there's YouTube videos you can watch that I will explain this slowly. I can explain it real fast, very easy. It's an anti-apartheid song, and that's about it. It's got nothing to do with killing white people. Now, we all know that a lot of these people are still pro-apartheid, and so which by the way, apartheid would be the balkanization of cultures in South Africa, as this guy adds in his videos. So he should be pro these songs. It's anti a system of balkanization. Now you might be thinking, what are you talking about? surely the whites don't want to separate from the other South Africans. Well, let's look at a specific area in South Africa. It's called Oranje, and it's a place where Afrikaners believe only Afrikaners should be allowed to live there. They've allowed black people to visit, so I guess they're not against visitations, but they believe that the Afrikaners should have their own separate state inside of South Africa where they basically get to have their own laws, their own money, and all that other stuff. Where's the Sagan of Akid video about multiculturalism failing and how these people should integrate into the greater society and not consider themselves a different entity than the nation? Otherwise, they are terrorists, according to Sagan of Akid.
Like, it's just absolutely crazy that this is their chant. And the EFF, they're not a small party, by the way, right? They're way more successful than Reform is. They've got 1 million members. 1 million people.
Well, in order to explain why they have 1 million members, remember the name that he gave for the party: Economic Freedom Fighters. Their main concern is financial, it's money, it's redistribution of wealth, it's uplifting the poor population of South Africa. That's why most people are part of their group. Showing them singing a song of anti-apartheid, which everyone should agree with anti-apartheid stuff, but showing them singing a song and then boogeymanning it, meaning 1 million people just want to kill. Come on, stop it now.
Subscribe to this party. They have 39 out of the 400 seats in the National Assembly and various others in various other parts. Like, they're not an irrelevant party. They're 10 times bigger than Reform is in the UK, just FYI. And so it's like, okay, crazy. So you'd think Cyril Ramaphosa would be like, yeah, no, they're bad, but no, apparently he has not in any way condemned them.
Well, first of all, when they do bad things, they have been condemned and they have lost people in their party who were to be lost, people who shouldn't be in the party because they were too extreme for the party. And secondly, why should they be condemned for stuff that's normal?
And instead, what he's done is try to shore up his left flank by expropriating their property. And it's like, oh, insane. Absolutely insane that they can say, no, there's no persecution of white people in South Africa. There obviously is. You guys are mental. There is no way.
Since he's just rambling about nothing, let me add further information. Most white people in South Africa do not live on farms. They live in cities and towns. A lot of them live very wealthy lives in South Africa. There's a lot of crime in South Africa, but the majority of it affects black citizens. And yeah, basically that's what I want to say, because all this context matters when you take all of this. And then of course we suffer from international people, especially Elon Musk, who are accusing the nation of being genocidal.
I would recommend anyone live in this country if they're not sufficiently dark skinned. And that's not even talking about the genuine material problems, as in the rolling blackouts, the failing economy, the fact that there's such incredible problems. And again, there are just racial affirmative action laws for the majority
To try and redress the stuff that was done in the past by the minority. It's that simple. If you attack someone over racial lines and I apply a law that protects those people over those racial lines, it's not an attack on you now, but oh, it's racial. Of course it's racial. You started it. You made it racial. We have to fix it racial. We can't be like, oh yeah, these people disallowed, let's pick a group, Indians, from participating in sports. Therefore, we're going to make a law saying that Indians can now participate in sports. Oh, but why are you saying Indians can put? Because they said they weren't allowed. It's like, never mind. Let me not use that as an example.
This is a form of racial prejudice, discrimination, and oppression against the white minority. There's just no other way to describe it. That's what this is. That's what it means when you're like, well, the blacks aren't doing very well, and therefore we need to have affirmative action for them.
Well, who else should it be for? If it's not fixing the poverty and the neglect of the African population, then who else should it be for?
Majority population of this country. That is crazy, and that's not going to last. And what you're going to see is the South African white population being like, you know what? I'm not sure there's a future here because we seem to be surrounded by people who are insistent on robbing us for all of our riches and then murdering us because we're white.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. People are living two great lives in South Africa to run away and go somewhere else. Some of them will leave. The ones who are living, you know, who want to go elsewhere should leave. I mean, I have no problem with them leaving, but I promise you, the millions of white people living in South Africa are going nowhere.
And so they're going to be like, no, we're going to have to leave because it's just dangerous to live among people who have been propagandized by communists since the mid 20th century to hate white people.
Connecting dots that don't connect. Since when was communism about hating white people?
Even though they didn't have all of these things before the white people arrived, did they?
They didn't have what things before white people arrived? What things are you talking about that they didn't have before white people arrived? I mean, if you say cars, nobody had cars until the 1900s. So I don't know what the hell he's talking about there. By the way, it's a jumble. He's just saying a lot of things that have no that are disconnected from one another. That's why my response is so weird.
And just to be clear, the finances of South Africa are just unbelievably bad. Right? Unbelievably bad.
Well, it's not unbelievably bad, but that's why people are joining a group called the Economic Freedom Fighters because they want to increase the finance. That's their main concern. But then, of course, Western countries, well, bad people in Western countries want to refocus that mind to, oh, yeah, it's genocide is the biggest problem in Africa when it's actually making sure that there's more wealth within the areas of poverty so that the nation can rise in a better way. Now, are there places that are affluent? There's a lot of them. South Africa is a pretty rich place. People don't know this, but that we need equality of wealth in a sense.
This is from the Cape Chamber of Commerce and Industry. South Africa has fewer than 7.5 million taxpayers who are collectively supporting 28 million people who receive benefits from the government. That is mad. Absolutely mad. And
it is mad, buddy, and it's the heart of the argument that you don't understand. It's called white monopoly capitalism. As we read, white monopoly capital is the term that originated from South Africa and is often used to describe perceived concentration of economic power and wealth among white South Africans. It suggests that a small number of white owned businesses in an oligopoly dominate various sectors of the South African economy, thereby controlling significant resources and influencing economic policies to their advantage. The term gained prominence during the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa and has continued to be debated and discussed in political and economic circles. Proponents of the concept argue that historical factors such as apartheid policies that favored white individuals and businesses have led to an enduring wealth inequality in South Africa. They believe that white owned businesses continue to hold a disproportionate share of wealth and resource, impeding the economic empowerment of the majority black population. And to be fair, let's read the critics. The critics of the term, however, argue that it oversimplifies the complex dynamics of economic power and can perpetuate racial divisions. They argue that South Africa's economy has become more diversified since the end of apartheid, with significant black economic empowerment initiatives and the rise of black middle class. They also note that the concept of white monopoly capitalism fails to acknowledge the growing number of black-owned businesses and the role they play in the economy. So I want to know, is he supporting the concept of white monopoly capitalism? Because then we could agree. Yeah, it's abysmal when you find out that a lot of the poor people in South Africa is because of apartheid and it has not been addressed yet, which is what they're trying to do with the thing that you're going against.
If anyone thinks this is a sustainable system, they are mad also. And so they're literally like, well, look, that's 3% of people in South Africa who are paying 76% of all the personal income tax.
It's a weird way of putting a statistic. Let's just put the real one. 20% of South Africans pay 100% of the income. Well, not 100, but they pay a big amount of the income tax in South Africa, 20%. Now, even if this is true, who should pay the tax besides the people who are making the money from the system? If you're making nothing from the system, how are you going to pay it? And again, if you want to know why so many people aren't making that type of money outside of believing weird things, it's the history. And then some people are going to say, but what has the government done to fix this all these years? Well, they're trying now with this type of land reform and the economic freedom fighters and all the other stuff. But every move that is made by any of these people will be criticized heavily.
That is insane. This is an insane, like, inverse pyramid of benefits claimants to to taxpayers. This cannot go on. Having all of these racial affirmative action laws to essentially, just again, it's hard to just say that this isn't just open persecution, where they're not.
I love how for a second he was talking about how it's insane that the entire like a good chunk of the population lives under the international poverty line and has to sustain themselves off of government grants, which by the way, government grants are available in many countries, but they have to live off of government grants. And when he realized this, he just, in the middle of a sentence, converts back to racial injustice and blah, blah. What are you talking about, bro? You know, you can see the truth. This guy can see the truth. This guy knows the real problems with South Africa.
Not just saying we want to openly persecute the white population of South Africa. Like, this is unreal to see as someone from the first world, apparently, a majority white European country. This is just mad. And
Okay, again, he's just saying the same thing again. There's racial injustice. This is mad. This is insane. I live in the West. This is mad. This is insane. No new information provided, nothing to comment to.
if this is what it's like when you get a white minority country, well, this is a good argument to not have a white minority country, right?
So, what are you suggesting should happen? Like the black people in South Africa should leave? What are you suggesting? Okay, so they're a white minority country. We shouldn't have white minority countries, right? Okay, let's run with that. So, what's the conclusion of that? Either the white people leave or the black people leave, right? Otherwise, they will continue to live in a white minority country.
I don't want racial affirmative action laws for the majority. I don't want the majority of people to be subsidized by my tax money. I mean, again, how is that not just theft? And I also don't want lunatics, tens of thousands of them in stadiums, in a party a million strong, saying, kill the white man. Right? I don't want that for myself or for my children or my grandchildren. This is evil. This is wrong. And the thing is, the farm murders are just by far.
Okay, finally, he's going to say something new. Farm murders. Okay, let's go back to farm murders. Let's attack that directly.
Just some of the worst things I've ever seen. Right, I've read accounts and descriptions of what's happened, and if you want a sort of crash course introduction, Lauren Southern's Farmlands documentary is
one of the worst documentaries made by a human being, and they do not show anything in reality. As one of the people who actually supports the theory said, Lauren Southern had to walk past a couple of slums in South Africa to go to a semi-built up area in a white population and then find like two stories about how they sort of kind of knew a person who suffered crime. That was the documentary.
Oh, it's genuinely horrible. It's just genuinely horrible. Because what happens is, just out of nowhere, a small gang of black, I don't know, would you call them vigilantes? Or something? I don't know.
I know what he's already going to say. So, in order to diffuse some of the nonsense he's about to bring up, it's a small group of bandits who come in anywhere in South Africa and they basically hold people ransom or they kill people and they take their stuff and leave. And they do this because they're violent and they want to have their way. And the majority of people who are affected in these violent ways are people in black communities all over South Africa because there's poverty, and where there's poverty, there's crime. And you will find this in many places where there's poverty and crime. But to make it racial is propaganda.
Murderers will go onto one of these farms and then commit savage atrocities, the likes of which you have never even conceived of. Like boiling babies alive, because they're so far away from anyone that once they're in and they've like hacked down like the dad or whatever, there's nothing to stop them doing anything. And so they can do anything they want.
That's right. Once they've gotten rid of the black workers, they come into the house and then they look for the people who've got the money and then they start to threaten them for the money. That's what happens. Now, the way he's laying it down, it makes it sound like it's just a bunch of people who came with murderous intent. That's almost never the case. They've checked, and in most of the cases, it's bandits, people who came to take stuff, thieves.
And so they do just the most brutal things you can ever imagine. And she's got a whole slew of videos talking about this. And of course, the ANC don't want to talk about this because what this is stochastic terrorism that is ginned up by the EFF and given cover by the ANC because they're worried about losing their voters to the EFF. And so this creates, I mean, to call it toxic is to just not properly describe the scope of the issue, the breakdown of race relations in South Africa.
The breakdown of race relations in South Africa. When were they ever good? At what point were they good? Like where, their populations, the racial populations were just like high-fiving one another. It started back in the past. We all know how it got here. Let's not pretend that it's something that just happened out of nowhere. At what point did
was created? Like this is just, I mean, it's some of the worst stuff I've ever heard, and it's hard to believe that it's real. But I've got no reason to think that they're lying to me. And all the government can do is appeal to ideology. They can, there are no refugees here. No, what you're doing is you're undermining the democratic spirit of the law, and we're trying to right historic wrongs. It's like, I don't know, man. I don't agree with you at all. I think that basically you've got nowhere to go from this point. And one of the problems that you have with Trump accepting these people as refugees, I mean, these people may have had family members of their own hacked to death by vigilante gangs of blacks who were ginned up by Julius Malema and then essentially ignored by the AFC. I mean, what percentage of these farm murderers do you think are prosecuted for their crimes? Right, I bet it's
a lot of them. A lot of them are prosecuted. But of course, if someone does a crime and then there's no evidence, what do you suppose? Who do you go? Do you just arrest random black people? But the ones they do catch, they arrest them. They don't say, good job, buddy. That's what we wanted this whole time. They arrest them. They put them in jail. It tends to be done by poor people, which, I mean, if you know any nation, it's not going to protect poor people. It's going to throw them in jail.
going to be very, very low. In fact, I bet law and order generally in South Africa is very, very low. I bet the court system is not really very functional. I suspect this is why Orania can actually come into a being, because the central government is just not competent, because everything in South Africa is just being run incompetently. Again, you don't have rolling blackouts if your country is being run by competent people. If the people in the country work well to support the system, which they obviously don't, because they're mostly benefits claimants and not taxpayers, this sort of stuff doesn't happen. This is mad, what is happening in South Africa. It's a complete failure of the liberal dream. This should never have come about. And the fact that this has come about, following the most orthodox and extreme interpretation of liberal universalism, shows that this philosophy is nonsense, and this is a direct test case in how this will end up failing. And if it's failed there's no reason to think that this way of thinking and allowing these sorts of people to prosper isn't going to fail everywhere else.
Again, throwing disconnected thoughts. Now it goes back to universalism and how it cannot work and blah, blah, blah. But again, what are you saying? That South Africa should have never been a democracy? That South Africans should have never accepted democracy as a system? Because I know a lot of South Africans who will agree with you on that adopting Western society and Western democracy was a bad idea. And that if you look at violence, it increased dramatically when the Europeans got here, and that wars increased and all of that stuff. So if your point is Europeans ruined South Africa and now we are cleaning it up, then I think there's a lot of people who will agree with you. I don't necessarily. I believe that the we can live in harmony with many races in one country, but you know you admitted the other day to being a right winger, so I can see your point.
Decolonialist ideology is being applied inappropriately to England and is being used to rob us of our history and brainwash our children to think they are not the original inhabitants of this land.
This is the third video by this person, and you will notice that now, all of a sudden, nativism is very important. Before, in the other video, South Africans coming in, they didn't rob them of the land, right? But now it's robbing them of the land because he believes in nativism. But the natives of South Africa, that's like a different story. That's like, no, finders, keepers.
I'll show you how this has been done. So you remember back in 2014 when it was established that hunter-gatherers probably had blue eyes and dark skin. Now you'll notice in this estimation that they've drawn here that the dark skin is darkish, right?
Yes, I do notice that the dark skin is not accurately representing the skin color in which the scientists recommended, because they said that light skin DNA did not exist at the time, and so it was probably the same as any other dark skin population around the world, which is highly melanated.
We are talking about people who look like maybe Southern European or possibly slightly darker, but of course he's got blue eyes because he is a European man.
He has no evidence for this. They did not say that it was a mid-tone. They said the guy must have been dark skinned because there was no DNA for light skin until years later, and that's why they made him black in color. This recreation is to try and make it softer so that he still appears to be a modern European, which wouldn't be that deep of a find.
Now, this was then parlayed into this figure. Now you'll notice that
this figure, which is significantly darker, he is going to do his best to deny as being the accurate interpretation for his other one. The other one where the guy kind of looks like a white person still, because of course he can't be honest and just be like, okay, they were darker, but they still were our ancestors.
This figure this recreation has much darker skin than before. What are the odds? Why would they be doing that, you might think?
Because of genetic evidence, because most people came from the tropics before they ended up in the continent. Because at some point, if you go back in Europe, you should find a point where the people look like they didn't just originate from Europe, because they didn't. They moved into Europe and they would have looked that very different. That's why. But of course, since you're a political streamer, everything, even the slightest thing, has to become political. Even just evidence that people in Europe were slightly darker than they are today somehow is some great oppression.
Because and the thing is, I'm not here to debate the rights and wrongs of the science of it. I don't know, and I don't really care.
If you don't care, why the hell are you talking about it? So you don't even know, you don't care, you don't, but you're here fighting against it for like 3 minutes, and you have no idea what you're talking about.
I could believe that I've seen it being said by reports and people who are referencing studies that white skin developed in Europe about 7,000 years ago, something like that. So 10,000 years ago, or whatever Cheddar Man lived, yeah, he would have had darker skin than modern Europeans. Fair enough.
Well, congratulations for coming to the truth. Finally, you say something that I can agree with. Now, don't ruin it.
But was it that dark? What would be the need to have skin this dark in Europe? I mean,
This guy's an atheist, and I know he knows better. It's not need. It's not what is the need for them to have skin that dark. It's just the skin color they came with into Europe. And it was slowly changing for the environment. And it only recently changed.
vitamin D levels are a real problem for African immigrants to Europe. They actually do need, and it's actually really common amongst African immigrants in Europe for them to just have a culture in their own communities of taking vitamin D because
For anyone who's black who lives in Europe, can you confirm or deny that? That you guys have to constantly take vitamin D? I don't know. I'm not even going to argue with it.
this is an issue. And so, I mean, you could see why white skin would evolve because we need to see more sun than people on the equator. But also, it's more reasonable that he would be this sort of color than this sort of color.
It's more reasonable based on something he does not know or care about. So he's going to dispute scientists about how dark the people are based on reasoning, which is something he doesn't know or care about. That's very reasonable.
This sort of color is designed to protect you from the harmful rays of the sun. And I'm just saying, in Britain, that's not such a problem. Actually, I've been out in the sun all weekend. I'm not exactly scorched, am I? Anyway, so the reason I say this and the reason this matters is because, as you can see from this, we actually know that we are linearly descended from those ancient Britons 10,000 years ago.
Okay, so here comes the scary part. Now, no one is claiming that they're not. Everybody came from black people. Everybody is literally a person who came from melanated people in the past who gave birth to the white population. Otherwise, where did the white people come from? The problem, though, or the thing that they're trying to show, is that there is nothing wrong with being black. Nothing. Because there were people who were black in that area of dark skin. But he's going to look at it in a completely different way because, his concept of black is black African.
And in fact, there was a history teacher a mile and a half away or something from Cheddar Gorge, where Cheddar Man was found, who, after DNA testing, they found was directly descended from this man.
Yeah, and that's the facts. The facts are Europeans used to be dark skinned and now they're light skinned. And because they're unaware of that history, they think there's something wrong with being black, some of them. And they think that it's some kind of big deal. This shows that it's not.
So 10,000 years, his family have lived in this area, at least in part. That is a level of consistency that it's almost impossible to imagine, and you wouldn't have made it up, and you would never have guessed.
Okay, well, so he clearly doesn't understand what they're saying. Only part of his DNA comes from these people. The rest of it comes from outside of this specific region, ranging very far away. Also, you could make it up, and also it is very believable that everybody is related 10,000 years ago to a specific location. He's fighting against ghosts. Nobody's saying what he's saying, that Europeans just materialized from space. They came from darker people.
I bet he wouldn't have thought that his ancestors had been here for 10,000 years. Weirdly, they look kind of similar as well, don't they?
Well, of course, they look very similar. This is very good work, very well done work. They look similar. The skin color is very dark. It's good work. The only reason, the part that you dispute, the part that you go against, is the part that goes against your political ideology, which is why you should probably be thanking these people for telling you your deep history so that when you remake your history so that you can understand it visually, you now know the accurate interpretation of what the people look like.
I bet he wouldn't have thought this. And so this is probably more likely than this.
Based on nothing. Again, he just shows how biased he is. That when the information sides with him, oh yeah, they look the same. Well, it's pretty good reconstruction. And then when it goes against what he believes, well, it must be like that drawing that looks nothing like that guy.
And this, I find this totally reasonable, completely believe it. But the important part is the lineal descent, as in there is an unbroken chain that links Cheddar Man to modern Englishmen living today. And this is the important part, because even if he did have skin this dark, he is not what we would call in the modern day black.
Actually, he is what we call in the modern day black. And if that guy was walking around England today, he would be discriminated against as some kind of weird looking foreigner. He would have been discriminated against in a long time ago, from the 1100s throughout till today. He would have been like, "Oh, that's a black man." You really think that those people would be like, "Oh, no, 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 that guy who looks like that guy's got nothing to do with black. That's that's something completely different."
Black people is an appellation that we use to describe sub-Saharan Africans, people from Africa. Now,
Well, that's one of the definitions of black, and it's not even an accurate one because you find those black people who originate for tens of thousands of years outside of sub-Saharan Africa, like people who live in Egypt who've been there for tens of thousands of years and are still there today. They're not in sub-Saharan Africa, they're in Saharan Africa. And so, in your definition, these people are not black.
even if they have a similar skin tone to this guy, and this guy is correct, which, like I say, I highly doubt, I think it's going to be a lot closer to this guy, there is no lineal connection between sub-Saharan Africans and the ancestors of Northwest Europeans.
Well, the wording of that is weird. We know already that Europeans come from Africa, so we can already put that in there. Not to mention that North Africans have been known to travel to Europe many times. We find this in Crete and places like that. Now, I'm not saying it's as far as England, but yeah, some Africans, I mean, you call them sub Saharan Africans because of obvious bias, but some Africans made their way into Europe, just like some Europeans might have made their way into Africa. It was not a barrier, believe it or not.
They are two different peoples with two different histories, two different lineages, and therefore two different claims on two different continents.
I think what I find funny about what he's saying is almost nobody would probably agree with what he's saying. This whole two different continents, therefore they cannot interact. Even if you go on the other side, the people are claiming that Europeans came into Africa as early as 9000 BC from Spain into North Africa. Those people would not agree with him. I'm not saying I agree with those people, but that's what they claim. I mean, there's people claiming that North Africans went into Africa 9000 BC. I mean, it's pretty old. Now, of course, these specific people are European. They're 100% European. They just were black. Get over it. It's not that hard.
This matters because of what they've been teaching our children in schools. So, apparently, on decolonized history curriculums, a book called Brilliant Black British History by a Nigerian.
So the other people are lying because the information doesn't go with what you want to believe, and this guy is bad because he's Nigerian. Let's carry on.
Has informed our children that Britain was a black country for more than 7,000 years before white people came.
Well, longer than that, but that's a fact that you just showed us that it was. You know, the one where he said, even if I accept it, there are still the ancestors of the modern British population. Yeah, you just showed that.
That's not true. That's just a lie. That is a lie by Atinuki, a Nigerian-born British author. So a foreigner has moved here and decided to try and disinherit our children of their most ancient lineage and connection to their own country by saying because evolution is a thing and people change over time, then they are actually invaders to their own homelands.
So let's pretend for 1 second what he's saying is true. This applies to him too. So again, a foreigner, he doesn't even have the common decency to be foreign to our country. He's just someone who hasn't even come here before, claiming that the natives of South Africa are hostile to a minority population in which he knows nothing about. Everything this guy complains about, he does.
And in fact, some people from sub-Saharan Africa have more of a claim to being indigenous to Britain than the people whose ancestors 10,000 years ago, who literally, and it literally is their ancestors, 10,000.
Well, I'll just state that I'm not a nativist. I don't believe that nativism means that you have more of a claim to the land than anybody else. But I will say that unfair treatment means that, remember that thing you were talking about earlier about justice and who gets what and what gets with? Yeah, that's basically where it becomes a problem.
Years ago have less of a claim. This is preposterous. This is just an attack on our culture and our people and our legitimate claim to live in our own homelands. This is a form of colonization being done under the word decolonization. This is our culture being colonized by foreigners, by, in this case, a Nigerian who is using race politics to try and justify his presence here and delegitimize.
You don't see that as a problem? The fact that anyone who migrates to your country feels like they have to justify their existence?
Yours. The report has described the book as one example of how the push to decolonize or diversify history curriculums has gone too far. Gone too far? You think that's just a little bit, right? It's kind of understating it. Kind of like understating just how evil a thing that is being done to our children, right? Kids are very susceptible to whatever you teach them because they don't know any better. And if you're in a position of authority, they trust you. Therefore, telling them lies that black people ruled the country before white people came.
Okay, well, since I know this guy, I think he supported Brexit. Let me throw something else out there. How about the fact that 7,000 years ago there was no state like this in any way, shape, or form, and that people came from different locations of Europe into that region, and so by this nativist language, anyone who is in Europe has equal native claim to that one single spot. I'll cut the video off over there because he adds nothing else. Something he points out is there's a part where he says black people invented Stonehenge, which Stonehenge falls in the line where there still would have been these people who are dark skinned. So basically, he has a problem with calling people who have extremely dark skin black. That's the point of this video. Pointless.